a lot of growing up in our culture, there's this thing of don't close your door. Or if your door's closed, I as the parent will just walk in without knocking. A boundary would be, no, mom or dad, you have to knock before you come into my room. Just a small example like that. Or for example, it would be, I don't want to come to this family event. This person makes me uncomfortable. Or for example, I'm trying to think of a more recent example. For example, there's something that comes up a lot is where a mom would constantly call their child or call their adolescent or their adult child 10 times a day to figure out if they're okay or what they're doing. I think a healthy boundary would be to say, I'm okay, you don't have to call me constantly, I'm fine. A little bit of space and a little bit of distance between us is healthy. That would be a boundary. Yeah.
The Peak Performance Live podcast is sponsored by and filmed on location at the Pencil Club. The Pencil Club is a premium members club with prestige spaces to connect and inspire people. The club appeals to passionate and driven individuals with discerning tastes. With a gourmet restaurant, bar, fitness facilities, and luxuriously appointed meeting spaces, the club offers a complete environment for those with exquisite preferences. The Pencil Club is the highest point in Durban, offering panoramic views of the coastline and lush green rolling hills of Durban. Apply to become a member via the link in the video description. I'm really excited to have you here today.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah, Sanam Naran, the conscious psychologist. Didn't expect that you would accept the invitation, so I was very pleasantly surprised.
Yeah. I think I'm really excited to do my first podcast, and I love speaking about this topic, so yeah.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about you first and your childhood. What kind of a kid were you? Where did you grow up?
So I grew up in Lens, small Indian community, and I was the only child. I am the only child. I was a very composed, good, quiet child, and yeah, I grew up in a Gujarati family. Parents got divorced when I was around 3 or 4. I think it was a time when divorces weren't really happening, or they weren't really heard of, and especially in that community. And so my parents sort of kept it a secret for a while, and I had to also keep it a secret. And I think that plays a huge role in who I am now. I think it brought me a lot of anxiety as a child, and I'm quite an anxious person now as an adult. And I think that kind of formed the basis of who I am, and who I am in relationships and romantic relationships especially. And so yeah, my childhood was quite traumatic. It was quite turbulent, but it was my norm. I thought it was normal, until I kind of started going to school and seeing, my friends not really having the same kind of upbringing and the same sort of family that I was having. And that's when I kind of realized that, okay, this is not really normal. And so the nuclear family of having a mom and a dad and siblings having supper together every night wasn't something that I was experiencing. I remember my dad and I had supper one night, and I put out my mom's plate, and she just never came home. And I think that stuck with me my whole life, and I felt very abandoned as a little girl. And I think that's also something that I take into my adult relationships, is this feeling of abandonment, or this fear of abandonment. And then moving on later on in life, I think that's also what prompted me to wanting to become a psychologist. So yeah, I think that's sort of the gist of it. Yeah.
When did you decide that you wanted to study psychology?
I think the first time that I went to a psychologist, which was around, I think I was around 7 or 8, and my dad took me to the psychologist, and she was amazing. She was so warm and motherly, and I loved being in her offices, and I always remember feeling like this is what I want to do when I grow up. I want to help other kids, and I want to just be her. And from that moment till now, I've never thought of another career. Yeah, it's always been psychology.
That's quite special.
Yeah.
Do you feel that maybe you received some of that maternal energy that you were missing?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I think, yeah, she did play a role of mother in my life to a certain extent. And then only later on in psychology did I learn that a psychologist, how do I explain this? A psychologist would be projected into whatever you want them to be as a client. So we could be projected as the mother, we could be projected as the child, as the sibling, as the grandfather, as the grandmother, and it's a very nuanced concept in psychology called transference. So yeah, she definitely did play that role. Yeah.
Okay. With what you talk about a lot in your social platforms, the problems that we face as brown people, it's really interesting, fascinating to talk about and to listen to, because I think we've probably all been exposed to this. I'm talking about the Indian community in one way or the other, but I don't think our parents or our grandparents realized the gravity of what was happening to us, and how we would end up being restricted and confined by these belief systems and so on. So was a lot of this inspired by your own upbringing? Yeah?
All of it.
All of it.
All of it. And I think a lot of what I speak about on social media is what I've been through, and I feel like I can connect more to what I'm saying from having experienced it. Otherwise, I feel a bit like a fraud if I haven't experienced it.
And do you find with your clients that all of them suffer from the same things, with at least culturally?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I think there's so many patterns in what we've grown up with, and parenting styles that we experienced, and current behaviors and current struggles and symptoms and just patterns are very much aligned in our community.
So maybe let's talk about some of these early dysfunctional patterns that we adopt, like maybe during our childhoods.
Yeah.
And I think one of the earliest things that we're exposed to is indoctrination into religion, for example, or cultural norms. Like, how do you see this playing a role?
So I think it's an interesting conversation, because I think it goes back to colonization and how we were brought here to South Africa, and how we used certain protective measures in order to survive and in order to be okay. And I think religion was one of it. I think we adopted certain cultural norms and cultural and religious practices in order to survive those times. But a lot of that was, or I feel like a lot of that is forced upon your kids. there are those families, and then there are those who just kind of moved away from religion completely, and adopted other ways of survival, or psychic survival. And I think, now as adults, I see a lot of people struggling with religious trauma, where, like I said, religion was forced onto them and they weren't necessarily explained why they need to follow a certain way of life. And a lot of their self-worth is now connected to whether they are religious or whether they aren't religious. And there's a feeling of either a lack of belonging or a sense of belonging. And I think all of that plays a huge role in, you as a person and your mental health now, and the anxiety levels you feel, and depression and self-esteem and self-worth and that sort of thing. So I think that's one aspect of childhood and growing up in an Indian household.
Do you think that the religion is maybe one of the few things actually that they could control during colonization, because you're stripped of so many other things?
Yeah.
Is that maybe why they cling on to it so tightly?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I think that is one of the reasons. I think that helped them feel a sense of control during that time. But I also think you were shunned for not following a certain way of life. Yeah.
And culturally, like for example in India with the caste system.
Yeah.
I mean, as much as it's been abandoned, there is still some carried through, even here. I mean, people see themselves as stratified in society.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that, I think, also plays a role in self-esteem and self-worth. If you're not part of a certain higher class, then what does that mean about you as a person and your identity? And although these things may not, be fully followed now, it still plays a role in your psyche unconsciously, in a very unconscious way. And I, as a psychologist, believe a lot in the unconscious, and that's why I've called myself the conscious psychologist, because I think there's so much going on an unconscious level that we are not aware of, such as what you mentioned, the caste system, colonization, slavery, all of that directs our behavior now.
What exactly is spiritual bypassing?
So it's relying solely on God or prayer, for example, in order to defend against uncomfortable emotions. So for example, if you had to say to a parent, for example, I'm not feeling okay, I'm sad, I'm feeling a bit depressed, and the response would be, just pray about it, God will take it away for you. And it's that belief of relying on God to take away your pain and your emotions and make your life better without you actively doing something to change it. So it's bypassing those uncomfortable emotions and the harder inner work and leaving it up to God.
And it's in you had spoken about, in spiritual bypassing, you had spoken about nazar.
Yeah.
Yeah. What exactly is that for someone who doesn't know, is not familiar?
Yeah. So it's basically the belief in the evil eye, or the belief that someone can put eyes or a spell or that sort of thing on you because they're jealous of something that you have that they don't. And I think that people use that as an excuse, again, to not deal with their emotions. So for example, if they're marriage didn't last or didn't work out, they would blame that on Nazar. When in fact they have a lot of autonomy and responsibility for that relationship maybe not working out. So it's basically using Nazar and the evil eye to evade responsibility.
To externalize it.
Yeah.
And is this quite prevalent?
It's so prevalent.
Yeah.
It's so prevalent, and it's tough to work with because on the one hand you're not dismissing that it's real or that it actually happens, because you can't dismiss someone else's experience. But on the other hand, you have to see the parts that you play in your own dysfunction.
Is it difficult for people to make that transition? Because I imagine with some people, when it's so ingrained for so long, they may actively resist taking responsibility for these things.
Yeah, definitely. It's so difficult to make that shift, and it takes so much of time because there's a level of denial there as well. And that defense is used to protect them psychically from the pain and the hurt and the hurt that can come from taking responsibility. So that shift is very difficult.
How does that get ingrained into people by their parents and the grandparents?
Do you mean the Nazar or the evading
Nazar.
responsibility? It's something that is, I mean, if I speak about my own experience, I think it's something that is, you grow up with it and you hear your grandparents speak about it. And I mean, if I can think of a
practical example.
So I was I think I just had finished my honors and I just got into masters, and I was ready to tell the whole world about it because it's really difficult to get into masters. And so my gran had told me, no, don't tell anyone just yet. Get into it first, start your program, but don't tell anyone about it or else it'll go very wrong. People start to put eyes on you and you won't get to the end. And so that made me feel like I couldn't celebrate myself and I couldn't celebrate this huge achievement. And I had to hold back on a lot of my happiness and being proud of myself.
Yeah.
And then we take that on into our adult lives and we hold back on our happiness and we hold back on celebrating ourselves, having this fear that other people are going to take that away from you.
It must create a lot of anxiety.
Yeah. A lot of anxiety. And that's another pattern that I notice in our communities. There's so much of anxiety. And there's this underlying anxiety that we're not always aware of. It's not anxiety in the sense that we're shaking or we're having heart palpitations. It's just this underlying feeling of nervousness. Yeah.
Nervousness also based on things that are external. Okay. And some of the other patterns I think that we can talk about that develop along the same lines, because culturally we believe in karma. So when something bad happens, your experience and your emotions can be invalidated by someone telling you, but it was your karma or something like that.
Yeah. That's such an interesting concept.
Yeah.
And something I haven't yet spoken about on social media, but you've given me the inspiration.
Okay, great.
But yeah, it is that. It's exactly that yeah, you're going through something difficult, or you've experienced something difficult, and then someone tells you, or especially your parents and your family members would tell you that no, you've done something for this to happen. And then that's where the self-blame comes in, and then you start to think, okay, well, what did I do? What have I done in a past life, or whatever it is? And I can imagine that feels incredibly invalidating.
Yeah. And invalidating and also frustrating in a way, because you're suffering twice. You're suffering from whatever it is that you've endured, and now you're suffering because you believe you caused it in some way.
Yeah.
Which is really not fair.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it's such a fine line again, because we're not invalidating the fact that it may very well exist, karma. But then how do you grapple with the fact that yes, it's real, but no, I may not have done something in a past life or in this life to deserve this sort of pain. Yeah.
It's a very difficult concept to wrap your head around in that way. I mean, I think obviously there's some merit to considering it in terms of how you can modify your behavior, but when tragedy strikes, for example, then it's hard to reconcile it, because you think, could I have played a role in this somehow? And it's really impossible to fathom.
And it's also difficult because, I believe that in order to have the least psychic suffering or mental suffering, we need to take responsibility for the parts that we play in everything in our lives. But for example, if someone has experienced a traumatic incident such as a rape, you had no part to play in that. So it really depends. It's very complex.
Have you had experiences where you may have had a client that suffered something like this, but they were made to feel that in a way they shared some of the blame?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And it was just that. It was rape, for example. We do see a lot of cases like that. And what happens on a psychic level is we automatically blame ourselves when a traumatic incident like that happens, so that we feel more in control in a space that feels completely out of control. And so what our brain does is we blame ourselves and think of ways that we could have things that we could have done differently to not be in that time or that place at that specific time. And so trying to work with the client to take them out of that space, out of the blame and the guilt, is incredibly difficult. But yeah, it happens a lot.
Parenting styles in the Indian community, they can be prone to coddling and helicopter parenting. How does this create problems for the child growing up?
So I think this is another complex one, because there's so many different problems that can be created, and so many different ways that we can end up as an adult. So what might happen in one family, or what might happen to one person as an adult, might not happen to the next person. But just some common things that could take place. For example, if someone has had a helicopter mom, what happens for male specifically is that they grow up being very dependent on their mom and struggling to create their own identity as an adult, and tends to not know who they are as an adult, and may get into a similar relationship where they are dependent on their partner, or they need to be mothered by their partner. And that can cause a host of issues in that relationship. I think for a female it's a little bit different, because they would then also similarly struggle with their identity and who they are as a person, and never feel good enough in their adult relationships, because their mom or their dad never trusted them to make decisions on their own. And so you become an adult who struggles to make decisions, who struggles with self-worth, never feels good enough, gets into similar relationships where you need to be taken care of. Or, on the other hand, you need to do the caretaking. So you get into relationships where you need to take care of your partner, whether that's financially, emotionally, and you build your worth around taking care of other people. Yeah.
That can be quite dangerous.
Yeah. Yeah. Because when you take that away from that person, they almost feel like an empty shell. Like, who am I? And what more can I give besides this?
So how do people grow from that? How do they develop that sense of self if they have to change the way that they find their validation?
So I might be a bit biased, but I think therapy is the first and the best avenue to explore for something like that. I think working with a psychologist around your identity is incredibly important, because they're able to point out your blind spots and assist you in a way that you can find other things that you're good at and other strengths that you may not have seen about yourself. But I think the first thing is you have to know that you are struggling with your identity. You have to know that, you have to acknowledge.
To recognize it.
Yeah. Otherwise, it doesn't really help to go to therapy.
Do you find that people do recognize it, or does it need to be pointed out?
I don't feel that they recognize it. No, I feel like they usually struggle maybe with anxiety, or they're struggling in their relationships to feel fulfilled, or they're struggling with loneliness, and that's what will bring them into therapy. And then through the process, we will identify that, okay, but it's identity that we're struggling with. It's more around, what else are you, and what else do you bring besides the specific thing that you were validated so much for in childhood.
With helicopter parenting as well, I think motivation with a lot of parents is not wanting their child to make mistakes, and that on its own has negative implications, because mistakes are part of life, right?
Yeah.
And how you rebuild after that.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's where the lack of trust in self comes from, because you feel as if your parent didn't trust you to do things, or to live your life, and so you don't trust yourself, and then you struggle to make decisions. You might also struggle a bit with perfectionism, and needing to do things in a specific way all the time. Fear of failure comes with that. A lot of procrastination comes with that as well. Time management issues. So it's almost like it's a lot of things that can come from helicopter parenting.
And does that tie into the negative self-image that develops?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And that's where the I'm not good enough comes from. My parent never trusted me, so I must not be good enough. And so you view yourself in a way that is very warped. You view yourself in a way that is lacking. And going through life, through work, through your relationships, I think one of the biggest things I see is a lack of self-worth and not feeling good enough, and a negative self-image. And the way that affects all areas and all spheres of life is incredible.
And is that again something that you point out in therapy? Do people come in, they're just generally unhappy or unsatisfied, but they don't realize that they don't have a healthy self-image?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I think there are certain people who have a bit more insight than others around that. But I think through the process of therapy, and when they're ready, that's something that we point out.
Do you think parents are able to recognize this in their kids?
I think, again, it depends on how and self-aware and emotionally available the parent is. I think if you are a parent who lacks emotional availability, who lacks self-awareness, I don't think you would be able to pick that up. Yeah.
How would it look to them if they lacked that kind of awareness?
How would it look to the parent?
Yeah, what do you think they would see in the kid?
Possibly, so it could go two ways. I think one would be a completely introverted child, so a child who, isolates a lot, doesn't want to be around people, who may not have a lot of friends. And then on the other hand, it could be an overly confident child, maybe a bit egotistical.
Sort of compensating.
Yeah. It could also look like a child who is numbing a lot, so video games, substances, on their phone 24/7. Yeah.
It's interesting. It can manifest in a number of different ways.
Yeah.
Why do we have such an epidemic of fathers being emotionally unavailable in the Indian community?
I think again this goes back to the oppression that we faced, and men being expected to be slaves and work on the farms and go to war and that sort of thing, and they had to take on specific roles where there was no space for emotions, there was no space for vulnerability or anything like that. So in order to cope, they had to become very numb and very hard and rely on maybe alcohol and that sort of thing in order to survive. And then I think coupled with patriarchy and gender norms and cultural norms, where they were expected to be a certain way, again, there was no space for emotions. And I think that generational trauma was never worked on. And so that was passed on from generation to generation. And that's, I think, where we have males and fathers being quite emotionally unavailable in their relationships as well as with their children.
So with their partners as well as the kids. Yeah. And there's obviously the impact that it has on the child and on the partner. But do these fathers at some stage recognize that something's wrong and seek correction?
I think the majority go through their lives like this. I think it may ring an alarm bell somewhere where they notice that, okay, they're relying too much on alcohol, or they just don't feel fulfilled in their lives. But I don't think they are able to pinpoint it back to emotional availability or emotional expression at all. Sometimes it gets pointed out by their partners, by their spouses, or their children. But I think for the majority, no.
Do they see it as weakness?
Yeah, they still do. I think that's something that is so deeply ingrained, that any sort of emotional expression is a weakness and doesn't make me a good man. Yeah.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I mean, I've definitely seen that play out in various family members where some are so emotionally repressed because they believe any sign of an emotion is a kink in the armor.
Yeah.
But on the other side, there are those where emotional availability is actually seen as a strength. Those are in the minority, of course.
Definitely.
Yeah, very, very small minority.
Yeah. But I think also being emotionally repressed serves them in a way. It serves their need for avoiding those difficult emotions and avoiding the difficult parts of life, or helping them avoid confronting those parts of themselves. So I think it serves them in a certain way.
There's also the codependency with moms and their sons.
Yeah.
So maybe if you can explain first what codependency is, and then how that dynamic develops.
So codependency is a very unhealthy dependency on a family member. It could happen in a romantic relationship or friendship as well, but it's a dependency that lacks boundaries. So there are no boundaries within that relationship. There isn't a separation between mom and son or you and I. It's all meshed into one. So the mom sees the son as her, and he sees mom as him. So again, there isn't a level of independent identity. If mom is feeling sad, I'm feeling sad. So codependency is a very unhealthy enmeshment of a relationship. And I think that usually happens and usually takes place when the father is unavailable, whether he's emotionally unavailable or physically unavailable. They then rely a lot on each other.
The mom and the son.
The mom and the son, yeah, as a way to, and the mom specifically tries to overcompensate for the dad's unavailability. So although she thinks she's, trying to do something lovingly and caringly, it does a lot more damage than as opposed to just letting the son be.
And with that dynamic, does it also foster unhealthy gender roles?
Within the mom and the son's relationship?
Yeah.
It can. I think that another aspect to it is that, in brown culture, boy children are more celebrated than female children. And so I think the mom would almost put that son on a pedestal, and what that can do to the son as he grows up and as he gets into his own relationship is that he needs to be treated this way at all times by other women.
He becomes a little narcissist.
Yeah.
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 I was actually looking at it, and I was thinking that our culture, it kind of takes little boys and makes them into little narcissists, and it makes the girls into little people pleasers.
Yes.
And it's this very horrible dynamic that we cultivate.
Yeah. And I think the people pleasing from the female side comes from not having a dad that is there emotionally or physically, and so you overcompensate with other people so that you can receive that love that you didn't.
And how is something like that corrected with that generation? I mean, I suppose because not everybody will go for therapy, or I think particularly with the boys, they're less likely to see that there's a problem and believe that they may have a problem to begin with, because they've been on a pedestal. They have this idea that I'm superior in some way, nothing can be wrong with me. How do you address this?
It's incredibly difficult, but usually what happens is that their partners would bring them to therapy, or their partners will convince them to do couples therapy.
Under duress, I'm sure.
Yeah. Definitely. But again, not many of them will come to therapy, and again will live their entire lives like this. Not thinking that anything is wrong with them, but thinking everything is wrong with the people around me. But I think, ways to address this would be, again, to be speaking about these things more and having these conversations, and bringing awareness to the fact that, this is the way you grew up and this is the challenges I'm facing now as an adult. Acknowledge that, and then hopefully figure out ways to address that.
You should write a book, Sanam.
I want to.
How not to parent your brown child. Like, don't make these mistakes.
Yeah.
You know?
It's so difficult because I speak about this a lot on social media, and there'll be a lot of parents that would comment around saying, well, I'm not perfect, I will make mistakes. And whilst, yes, I acknowledge that, everyone will make mistakes parenting. There's a good enough parent, and that is good enough. But we also have to acknowledge that we made certain mistakes that have affected our children. And that doesn't make you a bad parent. That doesn't put the blame on you. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's down to intent, isn't it? As when they made whatever decisions they made when parenting this child, their intentions were never bad.
Yeah.
No one does that willingly.
Yeah.
I hope not. But obviously there are consequences. And can you explain what parentification is and how that manifests in our culture, especially with girls, I imagine?
So parentification is where you have taken on adult responsibilities as a child. And so you become parentified, or you take on the role of a parent. And so we say, we usually refer to an adult as being parentified because they display certain behavior that could tell me that they may have taken on these roles as a child. So for example, how this can manifest is not having a father that is present, and so you as the child would then take on the role of that father. So you'll take on the role of maybe helping your mom with certain adult responsibilities, such as being her therapist as a child, listening to all her problems that she's experiencing. For example, a boy taking on the financial responsibility, where they may have been struggling in the household. It may have been a child, and something that I experienced was having parents who were engulfed in their own turbulent marriage or turbulent relationship, and I had to then kind of take care of myself emotionally. Nobody was really there to
meet your needs.
Yeah, take care of my needs, and so I had to take care of my own needs. And this takes away your childhood completely. You're no longer a playful child doing childish things. You're now this mature adult in a child's body. Yeah.
It just clicked that also happened to me.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I didn't realize it at the time. Yeah.
It's something you don't realize.
Yeah.
It's just the way you are, and you don't think that there's anything wrong with it.
It's just your life.
Yeah. It's just who you are. It's, people usually say, it's just my personality. No, it's not.
Yeah.
You were conditioned in that way.
It's so interesting. And why is it that in our culture we worry so much about everyone else's opinion? Like, what will these people think? And, why is that such a big thing with us?
I think, again, it goes back to oppression and how we were, and the things that we had to endure as a community, as well as the caste system, and having these different layers within our society of one being better than the other. I think it also gives us a sense of control, a false sense of control, and helps us feel a little bit better about things. So for example, if a family is going through a really difficult marriage and they're having these marriage problems, they can then outwardly be perceived as the perfect family because they care about what would people think. And so again, it gives them that false sense of, I guess, soothing in a very difficult time. And so a lot of our validation and a lot of our approval is placed externally, so that we feel better internally, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I imagine that this can only endure for a while until the wheels fall off and you realize something's actually wrong that I have to address.
Yeah.
It seems like culturally that's what we do. We put it under the rug until we can't cope anymore, and then it's an emergency.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that is a lot of why some of my clients come to therapy, is because it's now in crisis mode.
Yeah.
I've shoved it under the rug for all of these years, and now I'm in crisis mode, and I want you to fix all my problems in
Now
2 weeks.
Yeah.
And I want to go back and live life.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And do you find that with your traditional brown clients, and we'll use them as an example for the community at large, that they'll acknowledge there's this problem that's been ignored, but do they actually want to address it, or do they want to dance around it and hope that things get better?
That's exactly it. I think for a large majority of them, they want to come to therapy because, one, it's now the in thing, and two, there's this expectation that you'll fix all my problems, you'll give me advice, and you'll tell me exactly what to do, and I'll do that and it's gone. But there isn't this investment into doing the deeper, more painful work, because you grew up in a family or in a household where the real problems weren't being talked about. So coming to therapy and talking about the real stuff is incredibly difficult.
Do you find that some people may come to therapy, scratch the surface and realize it's too much work, and then abandon it?
Absolutely. I think so. I've got a team of psychologists that work at my practice, and this is a debate that we have a lot, or challenge that we face a lot, is that they'll come for 2 to 3 sessions, not get what they expected to get, and then we'll leave, and then we'll say therapy's never worked for me, or I won't go back. And that's something we really struggle with, and I have to constantly psychoeducate on social media around what therapy really is about. And a lot of people aren't ready to delve into those challenges and confront themselves in that way. So our client retention is not always the best.
I think it means undoing your whole version of reality, to come to terms with realizing that your lens on life was not really accurate.
Exactly.
And that's hard.
It's incredibly difficult. And I think it's also, along with the stigma around going to therapy, that something must be very wrong with me for me to be going to therapy. And then when I'm in therapy, I struggle to be vulnerable because I was never able to be vulnerable as a child. I struggle to confront certain things about myself and undo all of this that I believed was true about myself, about my parents. And having to sit there and deal with that it's incredibly difficult. And I always acknowledge that.
Is therapy seen as a negative thing in our culture? Yeah.
Very negative. I think there's still, especially, I've seen this in my own family, is that when you go see a psychologist, you have to be mentally ill. You have to be psychotic to be going to a psychologist. You can't just go to a psychologist because you're struggling with your work relationships, for example. So there is this stigma that's still attached to it.
What would be the normal expectation in our culture? And you have these problems that you're facing. If you wouldn't go to therapy, what would be the alternatives? To pray?
To pray,
Yeah.
to avoid it completely, shove it under the rug, it'll go away by
Yeah.
itself. Then there's the belief that time heals all wounds. Just give it time and it'll go away, when that's not the case. And then the other would be just be positive.
That toxic positivity.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
And in our culture, okay, we've spoken about how the negative self-worth develops and so on, but positive self-worth is often tied to achievement and success. Is that also cultural, like,
Yeah.
because of our background?
Yes.
Yeah.
So I think that growing up, a lot of brown people experience only feeling loved for achieving something in school, or specifically school, so achieving a certain set of marks. That is when they're given the love and adoration and attention. And so they build their identity around, okay, I have to achieve, otherwise I'm not worthy. So there is this huge emphasis placed on achieving and success, otherwise I'm a failure.
That creates quite an imbalance
Yeah,
in life, because how do you find your fulfillment?
exactly.
Yeah.
And then there's this level of anxiety that is so debilitating, that I need to achieve all of these things. It's never enough, but I need to achieve all of these things. I go through burnout, I go through imposter syndrome, depression, anxiety, all so that I can achieve this one thing.
What's imposter syndrome?
So imposter syndrome is basically where you never feel good enough in what you're doing. So you feel like you're a fraud in what you're doing. So for example, I could have achieved becoming a psychologist, but when I'm now working as a psychologist, I feel like I'm never good enough. I feel completely inadequate. I feel like I'm an imposter in this job. And that usually stems from a low self-worth and never feeling good enough, never being allowed to make mistakes, always being forced to be perfect. Yeah.
And this is common?
Incredibly common. Yeah.
Yeah. So I've often seen in our community, we have so many professionals and experts in different fields, doctors or attorneys or whatever it is, but outside of the office, they don't seem to have quality of life.
Yeah.
There's no balance, no real passion, no curiosity.
Yeah.
It seems very empty.
Absolutely. And unfulfilling relationships. Being a one-dimensional human being. And although it's served us in a way where it's helped us become quite successful in certain careers and that sort of thing, financially maybe as well, but again, that there is that level of deep unfulfillment. So although you may be successful in your work, you're then there struggling with anxiety and depression and suicide and that sort of thing.
This is something that really should be addressed in our community to develop more balanced lifestyles and find more enjoyment just in life. Yeah.
Definitely. But I think it's not acknowledged at all, because I think there's still so much of emphasis placed on, well, we have to be a successful society, and look, we have so many doctors and we have so many successful people. Why would we want to look at the sides that I'm lacking?
Yeah. One of the things I've noticed is that importance is not given to these other pursuits, like say for example music or artistry or something like that. I'm involved in a few things musically, so a lot of people will approach and want to find out where their kids could go for music lessons, piano lessons, or so on. But invariably with Indian parents, they want their kids to learn an instrument not for the joy of learning an instrument or for developing artistry, but they're like, no, if they do this, they'll become better at maths, or they'll become better at something else, science or whatever it is. But they don't see the value in it itself.
Absolutely. And I think it's also used as a way of, okay, yeah, you can play this instrument or you can do this as a hobby, but your real job should be something else. Something with status.
That's a backup plan. Not even a backup plan.
Not
it's
even.
Just something on the side. So I think with all these things that we face growing up, with the parenting and the cultural biases and so on that we face, it'll be interesting to talk about how all of these come together to influence the way in which we engage in relationships.
I think that's such an interesting one, because there's so many different ways in which it could go. Again, but I think a pattern that I notice is just a lot of relationship conflict, whether that's abusive, verbal abuse, physical, emotional. But there's always a level of abuse that I pick up on, and I think also a level of superficiality within relationships. So not being able to address the conflict, again shoving everything under the rug, being completely conflict avoidant, but then building all of that resentment, and then it comes out somewhere. Through abuse or that sort of thing. And then another thing would be an aspect of getting into relationships that mimic our childhood, or being attracted to a partner that is familiar in terms of the needs that weren't met as a child. So there's always a certain level of unconscious attraction to people if we haven't dealt with those unmet needs.
You mentioned abuse. Is this quite a common thing in our community? Physical abuse?
Yeah, physical, emotional, financial. It's very common, and I think couples only come to us when they're at that level of crisis, when something dangerous has happened. And again, a lot of narcissistic people in those relationships, and undiagnosed narcissists. And so a lot of that, the relationship dynamic is based off of an unequal power dynamic. But again, it's very familiar for them because that's how they grew up. Yeah.
Why do people stay in these situations, abusive situations?
So I think it goes back to, for example, a very basic example. It's often more nuanced than this, but for example, if you haven't had a available dad, or emotionally available dad, you would then go through your whole life needing that validation and needing that paternal approval and love. And so you get into a relationship with someone who is completely emotionally unavailable and treats you or reminds you of that feeling that you received with your dad, which was unloved and uncared for, and I'm not good enough. And so they get into that relationship, and it's a very unconscious process where you're trying to undo what happened in your childhood, but you can't undo that because you're with the same person. And so that level of needing to undo is always there. And so you stay in that relationship and you stick through it, and you want to change them because you couldn't change your dad. And there's also that level of a lack of self-worth. And so you think that that's all you deserve. So it's a very deep, unconscious pull towards that person.
It's a very disturbing thing to know still occurs. So, at least a generation back, it was something that was quite common, where the men would smack around their wives, and it was kind of just something that happened, but that it's still happening is very alarming, and disturbing that people don't leave these situations. I think some of the arguments, just with someone I know, when it occurred in her relationship, her response was, he wouldn't do it again. But is that really the question you should be asking?
Yeah.
They're different questions.
Yeah.
Why is my self-worth so low that I stay in this situation?
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think there's also a level of, well, I may have witnessed it as a child, and so my mom was okay. She pushed through it, so I can do the same. But it goes so much back to self-worth and what you deserve. And I think there's also a level of manipulation on the other side, where he or she might say, I'll never do that again. I love you so much, I would never do that to you again. And you believe that.
Do you think being exposed to it when, as a child, you minimize and trivialize it in your own experience later?
Because you think it's normal. You think love should be painful. It's the way that love was modeled to you, and so that's the only lens that you have for a relationship.
And I think another difficulty is in the admission that it's still abuse, even if it's happened once.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Definitely. But that, I think, realization is so painful. Because you want to believe that, he or she loves me. Why would they want to hurt me? Yeah.
Because again, it's that lens, changing that lens on life. It's having to accept that what you thought was your reality is not actually real.
Yeah. So a huge part is what we were modeled, what a relationship has been modeled to us when we were kids.
Because that's, I think part of this discussion is the inability to recognize what's unhealthy, and how that inability is formed in our childhood.
So there's this tolerance for dysfunctionality, and a tolerance for pain, and we kind of play it off as, no, but I'm just strong and I'm resilient and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
But our tolerance for pain shouldn't be based off of our trauma.
When you experience that kind of thing as a child, does that drive you towards this hyper-independence?
So that's another layer of parentification, is being super hyper-independent. And not being able to rely on anybody for support, because you weren't able to rely on your caregivers for that support. You had to do it yourself. And you also don't trust others to be there for you or show up for you in the way you need them to. But then there's this level of praising people who are hyper-independent. But they're also struggling deeply with anxiety and perfectionism and burnout and that sort of thing. And unfulfilling relationships.
Does that push a person into the avoidant attachment spectrum?
It could. I'd say there would be some in that spectrum and some in the anxious attachment style, yeah. I think it depends. It depends on your own attachment to your caregivers, your primary caregiver. So for example, if your mom had an anxious attachment to you, you would usually take that on into your adult relationships.
It all goes back to our childhood, isn't it?
Yeah, it does.
Yeah.
It does, and people don't want to admit that, but it does.
And do you find that clients will often not have an understanding of how to resolve conflicts because of what was modeled?
Yeah. So I think what I notice is that there's a majority of people in our community who don't want to engage in conflict. So when there is something conflictual in their relationships, they will either shut down, completely walk away from it and ignore the fact that it ever happened, or they would people please to make it go away. Yeah, but there's no level of sitting down, communicating, being open, and owning your discomfort.
Trying to think of situations that I've seen and how they could have played out in different ways if these things were attached. And I think perhaps in some way these discussions were avoided because they feared an eruption if they voiced their concerns or their needs.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
There's often a fear of abandonment under that.
Yeah.
So if I voice my concerns, this person will leave me.
Yeah.
Or they'll abandon me. So let me just shut down and tell them they're right.
Given the gravity of some of these situations, would it not be better to be extracted from these relationships where possible?
I think when it comes to abuse, yeah, definitely. I think it's the better option to do that. But when there isn't abuse involved, then I think it's more worth it to address it head on.
Back on abuse, there's I suppose the difficult discussion to have with it, where people may believe it won't happen again. But in your experience, can these people change? Or if they've done it once, is there always the chance it could happen again?
I do believe people can change, whoever they are. I do believe that they can change, but there has to be a level of awareness on their part and a level of commitment to doing the inner work in order to change. So if they take accountability, if they get the help, do the work, aren't avoidant of the work, they can change. Yeah.
Okay. And we generally have poor communication skills in our culture. And is this just what's modeled, or is it something that evolved over time, that we didn't communicate because we just did what we had to do?
I think it's a bit of both. I think there was no time to communicate or energy to communicate. You know, for example, when we were in survival mode, communication was the last priority. And then through the years, through the generational trauma, in order to survive and in order to protect ourselves, we just didn't communicate, and we just shoved everything under the rug. And then it became modeled. It's something that was a learned behavior. So I think it's a bit of everything that played a role.
How do we learn to communicate better?
I think we have to first learn to be vulnerable. Because if we aren't able to be vulnerable, we won't be able to communicate. We won't be able to say, look, you really hurt me. So there has to be that level of self-awareness that, okay, I am hurt. Why am I hurt? And then be able to voice that. And then on the other hand, there needs to be a level of being able to just actively listen when somebody is communicating. I find that we are so quick to take things personally and respond, but just listening can do so much. I've also noticed that when someone is voicing their frustrations with us, we want to find solutions and we want to fix it because we can't sit with that discomfort. And that doesn't help that person who's trying to communicate with us. They might not necessarily want those solutions, and then they feel unheard.
Yeah. It's very interesting, because as the person that's receiving the information and offering solutions, you believe your intentions are pure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And again, I think that goes back to childhood, because if you didn't have a parent that was holding your emotions, you just had a parent that was, giving you a sweet when you were crying, or giving you solutions when you were crying. That's what we end up doing in our adult relationships, is that we can't sit with someone else's pain or our pain. So we rely on solutions to take away that pain.
It's really interesting. And why is it that dating is seen as something shameful in our culture?
I think it goes back to what would people think. So firstly, I think sex is very shameful in our culture, and I think that is associated to dating in a way. But also, what would someone think if they saw my daughter out with this boy and, they're not engaged, or they're not going to get married soon. Somehow there's this expectation that once we've left school, we're sheltered at home, and somehow we have to meet our husbands somewhere. They just have to fall from the sky. But you can't go out there and actively date, because that is shameful. And what does that mean for you as a female? How shameful it must be to put yourself out there and date. Yeah.
So someone must fall from the sky, literally.
Yeah.
Or it actually brought up something that I wanted to talk about, and I didn't put it in the notes, but that show, Indian Matchmaking.
Yes.
Yeah, because that, I mean, I watched it and it was hilarious, but so many problems, so many red flags.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I really enjoyed watching that because
Yeah.
it was like everything that I speak about on social media,
Yeah.
tenfold.
Yeah.
And it's crazy how a lot of these things are still being practiced. And how gender roles and the way we view compromise in relationship is so warped. And it's no wonder we have so many relationship challenges.
Because I think with so many of the examples in that show, whatever needs were expressed, her advice is, no, you need to suppress those needs and compromise on everything.
Exactly.
You know? Yeah.
Yeah. And I think there's a fine line there, because we can't compromise on everything, because then none of our needs are going to be met. And then there's also the other side of where I find that people are incredibly picky these days. But so much so because they are avoiding commitment and intimacy. So there is a fine line.
Is it avoidance of vulnerability?
Yeah. Absolutely.
So it's just maintaining control?
And not opening up or not being vulnerable to someone because there's that fear of being vulnerable. And so much of shame. I think a lot of our identity in Indian culture specifically is that there's a lot of shame. So much of shame in everything that you do, and you carry this shame everywhere. And so opening up to someone else and allowing them into the shameful parts of you is almost impossible.
It's also strange that in our culture, sex would be something shameful when there's such a body of work into sexuality with Tantra and Kama Sutra and all of that. This is something that people explored.
Yeah.
But then you don't talk about it.
Yeah.
You know? Like,
yeah. It's very interesting, because I think there's then that differentiation between the culture that we learned over time and then religion. There's very different aspects in that. And I think sex is so shameful because there's this level of it should only be for procreation. You know, it shouldn't be a pleasurable thing. And I think that was adopted along the way, and not something that our religion taught us.
do you think that's specifically for girls?
No, I think it's for girls and boys. More for girls, but I think for both. I think sex is such an uncomfortable topic that parents do not talk about it to their sons or their daughters growing up. And I think it's something that is hidden by both male and female.
A funny story came to mind, but I can't relate now. I'll relate later.
Okay.
But funny. When you talk about this enmeshment with parents and their kids, like codependent moms and sons, is this how it develops, that we don't know how to have any boundaries, like later on in life?
Absolutely. Because there aren't any boundaries within that codependent relationship, we struggle as adults then to have boundaries with other people, or to respect other people's boundaries.
Do you also notice in our culture that things like abuse can be trivialized or minimized rather to adhere to cultural norms or societal norms. An example where there's an incidence of abuse and the parents would tell the victim, work on your marriage, it'll get better. Something like that, you know?
Yeah, definitely. Then that happens every day. That instead of getting divorced, you have to rather work on your marriage, try a bit harder, because what would people say when they find out that you're divorced? So that would be, you know, another good boundary to have with a parent. Would be to, and I struggle with this one when it comes to boundaries, because a lot of the time I feel like it's so impossible to have boundaries in our culture and with our parents, because a lot of the time they take it so personally, and boundaries are meant to keep a relationship healthy. It's not meant to cut people out or not have a relationship with that person anymore. So I think it really depends on your relationship and how best you think that they would understand a boundary. But it is important.
And also, I think another way of minimizing experiences, negative experiences like this, would be to, well, what parents would often do is try to have you reframe it and say, well, just be grateful for what you have, you know?
Yeah.
This must have very negative consequences for the individual that's suffering.
Definitely. I think it invalidates your experience and your emotions. And so if that's something you grew up with, being told your whole life, just be grateful. Like, you're so ungrateful for feeling this way. You suppress those emotions and you believe that you shouldn't have these emotions, or you're too sensitive, or you're too much as a person. So you suppress these needs and you become an adult who has no needs. You invalidate your own emotions constantly. You believe you shouldn't have emotions, you shouldn't have those needs. And what happens is when they come to therapy, they struggle to express these emotions, but they struggle to tell me about their parents, and they don't want me to view their parents in a negative light, because they were always told that they need to be grateful. And so speaking to me in therapy about their challenges in childhood makes them feel ungrateful.
And shameful, maybe.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And shameful.
Because there is that undercurrent of shame for everything, really.
Yeah, definitely.
And one of the common dynamics that I think is a hot topic is the difficult mother-in-law in Indian communities.
Yeah.
Yeah. And does that always, not always, but does that commonly emanate from a codependent relationship with the son?
Usually, yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, usually. It's seen as, this person is now a threat to my relationship with my son. But sometimes it's usually codependency, but other times it's that there's so much of dysfunction within that family, within mom, dad, and son, that the daughter-in-law is almost placed as the scapegoat. So whatever issues we're facing within our nuclear family gets projected onto this outsider who is very compromising and who is very subservient and who will take all this emotional abuse. So that's sometimes the other side of it.
That must create a very unhealthy dynamic long term, because if the daughter-in-law is the outlet for this can only create building resentment, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And then that then comes out in their marriage. And then there's incredible, marriage turbulence. But I think another part to that is I don't want to negate the fact that there are always, not always, but most of the time, there are two parts to play in any relationship. So although there are incredibly difficult mother-in-laws and codependent mother-in-laws, there is sometimes this level of what are you bringing into that relationship for it to be this dysfunctional. So not to put blame on anybody, but there is also certain relationships that are difficult because both daughter-in-law and mom-in-law play a part in it being dysfunctional.
Why is divorce seen as such a negative in our culture?
Because I think there is failure attached to divorce. That you failed in something.
So if it's seen as a failure, do you think they perceive marriage as something that you have to win? Is it it's a contest?
It's an achievement.
It's an achievement.
Yeah. And it is seen as an achievement. And if you haven't gotten married at a specific age, you have failed, or what's wrong with you? You haven't achieved this yet. Why? So I definitely think there's a level of achievement placed on marriage.
Why do they view it as an achievement?
I think I think our culture has created milestones and steps to doing things. I think this is in most cultures, but because we as brown people place so much of emphasis on achievement, I think we place this emphasis on achieving certain things by certain ages. So getting your matric, getting a specific degree that has status, getting more degrees after that, then the next likely step is marriage, finding the one, and then having kids after that. And if those steps aren't reached, then what's wrong with you?
There's no emphasis on being happy.
None whatsoever. I think happiness is tied to achievement.
Yeah. Or if as parents we are happy that you have done this, you should be happy too. Be grateful for what you have.
Yeah. Definitely. But I think that nobody asks you, well, are you happy?
Yeah. It's not something you hear people ask. You would think it would be an obvious question for anyone genuinely interested.
Yeah, definitely.
Or do you think possibly it's avoided because they don't want the answer?
Yeah, I think that could be the reason. But I also think I don't think people who are unhappy easily say that, no, I'm not happy. Because it needs that level of vulnerability.
And possibly also it's shameful to admit I'm unhappy.
Yeah.
I think that it contributes to, like we were saying earlier, actually, culturally, we are people that don't often have a satisfying work-life balance. What can we do to change that as a community?
I think the first thing would be to build up our self-worth and our self-esteem. because I think that once that is taken care of, and it's a constant journey, it's not just taken care of and then it's done, but if we can, notice that, or if we can build up our self-esteem and our self-worth, we can then give more to ourselves. So we can engage in self-care. We can recognize when we're burning out, and we can do more things that we love and that we feel like we deserve to do. So I think it's easy to say, okay, you need to have a work-life balance. You need to go and take a bubble bath after your hard day, or go out with friends after work. But if you're not truly working on that worth and that self-worth, you're not going to enjoy when you give to yourself, if that makes sense. Yeah. And you're not going to do it consistently either.
I think with a lot of people, like you're saying, their self-worth is so tied to pleasing other people. They don't even have a sense of what actually makes them happy. And not being exposed to anything yet, because most things are done in service of someone else.
Yeah.
So it is a very difficult thing to undo.
Very difficult.
Yeah.
I think we grow up believing that we have to constantly do for others, and our joy will come from doing from others, which might be true, but I think there's also a level of, well, we've completely dismissed our own needs through the service of others.
That actually ties into, I think, one of the core principles in like religion, for example, because I think what underpins Hinduism is service. That's something that's expected of you. So possibly that's developed culturally because of that.
Yeah.
That you must please others in order to validate
good
your
karma.
own your own self-worth.
But I think we've missed the balance somewhere.
Oh yeah. There's no balance at all.
Yeah.
I suppose you would count yourself lucky if you do have self-care practices that fulfill you. Yeah.
And I think there's a lot of guilt that is associated with doing self-care in our community, because you always feel like, okay, if I'm relaxing, or if I'm doing something for myself, I'm not doing enough, I'm not working, I'm not achieving. So even when there is some self-care practices, it's linked to a lot of guilt, which is very difficult to push through.
What do you do for self-care?
Therapy. And I've also been very conscious about time off and relaxation. So even if that means just sitting by myself without any music on, or without any noise, without my phone, without doing something, just sitting and just reflecting on maybe how I'm feeling or how my day has gone, I tend to enjoy doing that, just sitting in silence, as a form of self-care.
Okay. Do you have any outlets? Passions?
This is something I struggle with, because I would say my outlet would be social media, but then that's associated with work, so it's not really. I used to dance, and now I think it's just reading and being with family. Yeah. But I think growing up, I really struggled with that part of my identity around what do I actually enjoy? What are my hobbies and interests? What are my own hobbies and interests?
Were you driven towards academics?
Yeah, always. Driven to academics, and then you have to go for dancing lessons as a child. So that wasn't necessarily my love. It was the love of culture and family. but I had to slowly work on what did I actually enjoy besides from academics. And it's something I still struggle with.
You still, okay.
Yeah.
You need to find time to do that.
Yeah.
To find those outlets, expressive outlets, whatever they may be.
Definitely.
Yeah. Another thing that I think I've noticed, and I'm sure you will have as well, is culturally we don't really have any guidance towards meaningful health and wellness. Do you know? Dietary guidelines in the community, there is none. Participating in like sports or fitness or whatever, it's not something that's done at a broad level, you know. And we have a pretty unhealthy population.
Yeah.
Diabetic, overweight.
And I think when we are told to exercise, or not exercise, but go for swimming lessons or go play soccer or tennis, it's usually associated with that tick box of, okay, I need to achieve this. You look good on your
CV,
for when you apply to university.
Yeah.
But it's never taught as a way of looking after yourself. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, and that's very hazardous long term. In fact, I was looking at statistics in India, and I think it's in India they have one of the highest rates of heart disease and type 2 diabetes anywhere in the world, because they are terribly unhealthy.
Yeah.
And there's this idea that if we're vegetarian, we're healthy.
Yeah.
Do you know?
Yeah.
You're eating deep fried carbs all day long, how healthy are you going to be? You know?
Yeah.
Yeah. There's maybe a little bit of, I suppose, unawareness of what is actually healthy or not.
I think it's never been taught ever. And then a level of guilt around, well, if I'm going to learn how to take care of my body, that means I'm
taking away time from work.
Yeah. or I'm giving to myself when I should be giving to others.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And really your ability to give to others comes down to your health first.
Exactly.
Because if you're not in a good state, you can't give anything to anybody.
Yeah. Definitely. And I think the other thing that now that you say that, you know, there seems to be this drive recently for Indian men specifically to go to the gym, and which is great. But there's also this level of, okay, I'm gonna look after my body, but completely dismiss that I need to look after my mind. And although, you know, exercise helps with the mind as well, it should never be used as a way of, okay, I'll only give to my body, but negate the mental health aspect of things. And a lot of men will say, well, gym is my therapy. But I think we have to, there's a balance there.
Yeah. So what would that ideally look like? Do you think everyone should go to therapy?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I think it should be a prerequisite. I think emotional intelligence should be taught in school as a subject. And I think therapy should be something that everyone has to go to. Yeah.
I wonder if it wouldn't be something that they could implement in schools. I know at some schools they do have counselors, but they're usually there when a problem arises. It's not routine.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's just to deal with that specific issue, and then it's over.
Because it's true, we don't have any system to teach emotional awareness.
Yeah. Yeah.
And we find out too late in life.
Exactly.
You know? And then we need to go into therapy.
Yeah. And then we can't even identify a basic emotion as an adult. So I do think it should be implemented in schools.
Yeah. Okay. This podcast is about peak performance, living your life at its peak. And what would that look like to you? What do you think a peak performance life is?
I think it would be an authentic life. Just living authentically, not having to live through a lens, a prescribed lens that society has created for you, but also a holistic life. So taking care of self, mentally, emotionally, physically, and in all aspects, and not ignoring specific aspects. Yeah, I think authentically was what comes to mind.
And do you think there are universal positive habits that we could all cultivate to lead towards this?
I think from a very psychological standpoint, I think we could be more honest with ourselves, honest around what we're feeling, what we're experiencing, and in that way we're able to become self-aware. And I think self-awareness is one of the most important things in life in order to live a fulfilling life. Otherwise we're just going through life in survival mode, and that's never fulfilling. So I think self-awareness is something that we can develop. It's not difficult. Yeah, I think that is one of the most important aspects of what I think. And in that way we're able to have more fulfilling relationships, and I think relationships is so important in order to live at your peak.
What do you find are common bad habits that people should avoid?
I think notice when you're numbing and notice when you're avoiding something. So whether this is scrolling on our phones for a long period of time, or watching Netflix for a long period of time, or binge eating. Sometimes all of these things are okay, but notice when you're doing it as a pattern. I think we get so wrapped up in life and work and, again, being in survival mode that we don't really stop and ask ourselves, well, are we okay? And I think that's something that we need to really look at in order to live a more fulfilling life.
Okay. I may know the answer for this one, but usually I'll ask what's one piece of advice that you would offer to anybody.
Okay. Go to therapy.
I was just going to say, I thought that would be the answer.
Yeah. Go to therapy, and it's not what you think it looks like in the movies, you know. It's not someone just sitting opposite you and just listening and nodding their head or asking you how you feel. Go to a good psychologist that comes with recommendations. Go to a psychologist that is able to take you back to your childhood and work through all those issues and pinpoint where it's coming up now in your adult life, and is able to give you realizations about yourself. But first, be ready to work through those things. Yeah.
I think that is the difficult thing for most people.
Yeah.
The willingness to work through it, because, like you said, they want a magic fix.
Yeah.
Wave the magic wand and I'll be better, and my problems will go away.
Yeah.
Okay. I normally finish with a quotation or some words that remind me of the guest in some
Okay.
way. In your case, I found something because I think it's something that you are actively working on that it doesn't seem too many people are working on. So this is a quote by Resma Menakem. It says, trauma in a person decontextualized over time looks like personality. Trauma in a family decontextualized over time looks like family traits. Trauma in a people decontextualized over time looks like culture. And I think you are helping to identify so many of the challenges that we face in our culture.
Yeah.
And it's needed, and it's valid, and I really hope people start paying attention, because we can't afford for the next generation to carry through the same problems that we faced historically. We have to do better.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think that quote sums this up completely.
Yeah.
But I think, I just want to say thank you for opening up this space to have such discussions, because it's incredibly important and it's something that is not being done.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks, Sanam. I think I mentioned it to you earlier. I can't remember if it was earlier when we were having coffee or if it was when we were seated here, but I was very pleasantly surprised that you accepted. I didn't think that you would.
Yeah.
So I'm so glad to have had you on.
Yeah. Thank you. It's been such an interesting conversation. I can speak about this for days.
Okay, great.